Episode 79, Potatoes and Other Possibly Foreign Vegetables. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how early American vegetables were mostly global vegetables, and what was normal food, what was regular global food, and what was weird new food, local and global, in the 18th century English colonies. And because this is a big topic, this week is mostly taken up with all the potatoes. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that by the middle of the 18th century, our colonists saw themselves as pretty well settled in. This North American colony thing looked like it was going to take. The menu had expanded from the bare bones of ship stores and whatever anyone could find to actually being a bit sophisticated. Sure, there was nothing as nice as Mexico City or Cap Haitien with cathedrals and opera houses, but the place was coming along. And so to that end, a set of produce was becoming defined as American colonial food. There was a north-south divide, what I'm coming to call the sweet potato pumpkin line, where sweet potatoes could no longer grow and pumpkins took over as the orange vegetable. But all over, there was a set of vegetables that were considered normal, civilized, homegrown, American even. Then there was a set of produce that, while definitely foreign, was still considered normal, if not local exactly. Everyone who had it together had these around. And then, in this 18th century, there was new stuff from abroad. Some things were fancy, some were pedestrian, and some, well, the jury was definitely out. Their fate, who was going to eat them and why, was still up in the air. And the fun part, of course, is where things were from, compared with where people thought things were from. Because this was often not the same at all. I mean, we did import turkeys back into their home range. So let's take a look at the 18th century vegetable lineup, and then next week, we'll look at the fruits to see just what is going on. I'll get into this more in an episode not too far in the future, but foraging for plant matter in the 18th century was not cool. It happened. Almost everyone did it, but it was seen as something one was looking to leave behind once the farms we were working so hard to build provided all that we needed. And so it was the cultivation of vegetable foods we brought into the farmyard and domesticated there. That became the focus of our 18th century colonists. To them, what grew on the farm, inside the fences, that was local food, regular food, good civilized food. What grew outside the fences, that was foreign or savage or maybe both. What the colonists brought with them in the 17th century and what they brought in the 18th century to grow in their gardens and on their farms looked pretty similar. Someone coming from a European or English farm would find much of the same produce they had at home, with not much stuff missing. The galaxy of brassica plants, mustards, cabbages, coleworts, turnips, even broccoli-type stuff, and winter greens. Then there were the lettuces, radishes, horse, and other sorts, cresses, peas, onions, and leeks, and even parsnips and carrots and cucumbers were all there. The range of tender and woody herbs were present, the familiar stuff, parsley, sage, thyme, savory, lavender, marjoram, mint, the balms, those two. But there were also additions that were not normally found in the English garden. The pumpkin, the tender summer squash, Jerusalem artichokes, which are the roots of a particular type of North American sunflower, the pole beans, the bush beans. These were American vegetable crops that had been completely absorbed into the colonial diet. They had been introduced out of necessity. The original wheat and barley crops had been woefully inadequate, and many of the English vegetables had not been up to growing in this alien land at the hands of people who kind of didn't know what they were doing. These are things that had started outside the farmyard, but moved quickly inside and became part of the English-American scene. And then there were the oddballs. Corn, or as it was getting called, maize, Indian corn, samp, or hominy, depending on where you were, and white or Irish potatoes, and sweet potatoes. As we all know, corn had been exported back to southern Europe and West Africa and then all around the world just as fast as it could go. This was just an incredibly productive grain, and since the whole world was nearly entirely agrarian and most everyone was eating plant foods for most meals these days, with a bit of meat added at the edges, corn was absorbed with joy the world over. So more than one new arrival coming to America, colonist, servant, convict, or enslaved person, may not have been quite aware just where the corn was actually from. Or maybe they simply assumed it just grew everywhere. The potato story is even twistier, because there are two potatoes. The first was the warm weather lowland sweet potato that's from the morning glory family, Ipomea batatas. The second was the cold hardy mountain grown starchy potato, Solanum tuberosum from the nightshade family. So this is a distant cousin to tomatoes, eggplants, and chilies, along with belladonna of many a medicine cabinet, beauty routine, and Gothic novel. The sweet potato was the first American tuber to cross the Atlantic back to the Old World side. Columbus ran across them just about right away, and just about right away brought them back. It was a big hit as an import in Spain and as an export out of Spain, as it was sweet. Southern Spain had a climate it liked, so the sweet potato moved right in. Along with Spanish wine, oranges, and raisins, the sweet potato made it to England and was served to the wealthy as a way to feed the ever-expanding sweet tooth of the realm. A pudding of spiced sweet potatoes and raisins of the sun was an exotic addition to an Elizabethan table. In fact, in English cookbooks printed before about 1740, when the word potato appears, sweet potato is the assumed potato. The white potato, it turns out, was around, but not really eaten by the sort of people using cookbooks. Not until after the middle of the 18th century. And during that middle of the century time, well, you had to decide which potato was meant by context clues. Cookbooks of this age were simply not there to hold your hand. This life of the sweet potato as a sweet treat for the fancy rich people meant it was not on the radar of most of the colonists who headed for the North American colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries. So when they ran across it, they were not aware of its famous reputation back home. The sweet potato also seems to have sprung from that botanical hotbed that was the northern part of South America and Central America. Because sweet potatoes are not as hardy and as adaptable as corn, they did not head north into the dry and cooler climates of the North American Southwest and Middle. Instead, they made it to the North American Southeast by traveling along the islands of the Caribbean Sea and got to North America most likely through Florida. From there, it seems like sweet potatoes moved north as far as they would grow along the same East Coast trade network that moved so many other objects and technologies around this area. So when the early colonists were made aware of the sweet potato, they saw it mostly as a strange root to be eaten in times of want. Its reputation as a food of the rich hadn't made the trip. And the sweet potato, even though it was there first, was regarded as a savage food. Not something a civilized person would have in their garden. Not at this point. And the greens, though tasty and nutritious, and in no need of, say, pre-soaking to do something like remove stinging hairs or thorns or anything else, the leaves were never added to the list of stuff we could eat. After all, for the English and most Europeans, tubers were not on the list of tasty favorite foods. Sure, parsnips and turnips and scarrots and carrots were around, but they were nobody's idea of a treat. Experience and habit, as much as anything else, caused most colonists to roll their eyes at the sweet potato and mostly pass it by. The African population of the British colonies had different feelings, and this is where the whole yam kerfuffle likely comes in. While colonists had brought or tried to bring as much of their home food as they could, the people actually doing much of the labor to establish the growing colonies as an economic powerhouse were not so fortunate. The West Africans put to work to grow sugar, rice, coffee, indigo, herd cows in the woods, mill grain, mine iron ore, burn charcoal, and any number of other backbreaking tasks to set these colonies in a financially stable situation were not so lucky. While many were fed on the foods of home on the way over, mainly a variety of beans, peanuts, palm oil, and yams, once they were offloaded, the foods of home were mostly gone. Fish could be caught, leafy greens could be found, corn, which had been brought to West Africa by the 16th century and the Portuguese, was there, but so many other things, spices, herbs, nearly every fruit and nut, they were all gone with nothing to replace them. Possibly most missed were the yams. Eurasia and even Africa, north of the Sahara Desert, are grain-facing societies. Since at least the Roman Empire, once grain, wheat, oats, rye, barley, and so on, arrived in the neighborhood, when the diet of a regular person was examined, cereals showed up as the most common item. Not necessarily the majority of the diet, but a plurality for sure. And yes, there are pockets here and there where grain was more of an import, but in the main, these were all bread societies. Grind the grain, cook the bread on a hot rock or in an oven. South of the Sahara, the major starch source was yam. Again, not everyone, everywhere, all the time, but an awful lot of people in lots of places, a lot of the time. And like cereal grains, there's a variety of options. There are a whole bunch of yams to choose from. They can vary in size from tens of pounds to just down to 2 or 3, and they can be processed in a variety of ways. But starchy yams hold the same role as cereals and breads in Eurasia. Oh yeah, and they can withstand all sorts of climate extremes, heat, drought, but not cold. So while some things like rice, black-eyed peas, and okra could all make the trip west, for a long time, yams did not. The enslaved Africans, as they were sorting out what was food and what was not, in the landscape of their new homes, among the fish and greens and rabbits and new herbs, the sweet potato was like meeting a cousin when you're missing your siblings. Not the same exactly, but it would do in the absence of anything else. So starting in the 17th century, the sweet potato, what once was a treat for queens, was recast as a food for bad times and the enslaved. Some of the earliest writings about sweet potato in English come from encounters with the locals that lived in La Florida outside the orbit of the Spanish who had claimed it. It was prepared in a variety of ways, but baking it in the coals was most common. Eating it plain, mixed with other foods, or shaped into a cake known locally as pone or apone seems to have been the preferred way to prepare it. All of these were accessible to the West Africans looking for their yam substitute, and since they were eating the most sweet potatoes in the presence of people writing cookbooks and journals, by the middle of the 18th century, yam became a word that was commonly used for sweet potato. Yam appears in Amelia Simmons's cookbook and will appear in other cookbooks frequently through the 19th and even 20th century. However, sweet potato will also appear in cookbooks written both north and south of the sweet potato line. Right from the start, there is no agreement on which name it should have. It tended to follow local custom, and even local custom used both names. I have 19th century cookbooks that contain recipes for potatoes, white potatoes, Irish potatoes, sweet potatoes, and yams, all in the same book. Nobody seems to have spent much time worrying about it. Just as with the pumpkin in the north, the sweet potato was there and was included in the provisions, but rather grudgingly. It was generally passed over by those dictating fashions in food. By the 18th century, as sweets and sweet pudding in particular started to appear on ever more elaborate tables, the sweet potato's profile was raised. It was eaten, appreciated, but it didn't quite spread, partly because it was difficult to grow up north, partly because it kept getting looked down upon as grubby food for savages and the enslaved, and partly, well, fashions are fickle and I don't really know why. But also partly because the English colonial ability to name stuff continued to fail them. They simply called everything new that grew underground potato. Lots of naming was simply local and practical and didn't have much else in mind when it was done. So anyway, our English colonists, or maybe just the English generally, ended up calling all these New World underground starchy thingies potatoes. The reason I'm really making a thing about this is, of course, there was another potato, and because this one clearly came from far away and for other reasons I haven't really been exactly able to make sense of, the other potato, which entered English consciousness as the Virginia potato, and then would be called the Irish potato, for a long time in the colonies and America, it became the potato. Yes, this is the next twist in the potato story. While the sweet potato became the potato of the poor in the colonies, it had been the opposite in England and Europe. The sweet potato had been the Spanish potato, and as an import was the fancy people potato, and thus it showed up in the fancy dishes written of in cookbooks. The starchy potato, the potato of Virginia, which served as a fallback in poor grain years, the starchy tuber domesticated by the Inca Empire and the Bolivians, in Europe, its fate was to be cultivated in Ireland and in Northern Europe to feed the peasants, something to stand in for bread when there wasn't enough bread. But in North America, the tables were turned. The Incan, or the Virginian, or as it came to be known in the colonies, the Irish potato, that was the import. The sweet potato was the local product, and so it was looked down upon as uncivilized. And with that, the white potato, the Irish potato, became the civilized potato, the proper potato, and the yam or sweet potato was the other. In the early 1500s, the Spanish made it over to the Pacific side of South America and invaded Incan society. They found jade, they found gold, they found an incomprehensible picture-based writing system, and piled stone constructions so overawing people still want to blame them on visitors from outer space rather than concede people who saw the wheel as a toy rather than a serious machine could have built them with their own engineering. Those puzzle piece stone constructions that continue to defy devastating earthquakes show that there's more than one way to build a pyramid. And they've also shown that corn is not the only plant food that can build an empire. The Aztecs had corn, the Incas had potatoes. And just like corn, it is a really good food for expanding a population, especially in places that are a bit too high or a bit too north or a bit too south and thus too cold for corn. So while the stone shaping and construction techniques were lost, the powers of these amazingly shelf-stable tubers of nutrition were not. Baked in embers, cooked in soup, mashed for tamales, and dried for storage, and all sorts of ways they were functional in filling bellies. Fried in the imported pig lard and washed in brine and maybe hit with a little vinegar, then they were transformative. These Incan nuggets of energy and nutrition spread around the world. We think of potatoes as sort of being maybe an 18th century global food, but it turns out there are traces of 16th and 17th century transoceanic introductions to be found in Spain, in Holland, in England, in Ireland, in Sweden, in Russia, in India, in China, and even in 17th century Virginia. As a new food in these alternately hopeful and suspicious times, the Incan potatoes were appreciated on occasion, but were more often viewed with suspicion. One superpower of the age was plant identification. So it was clear to everyone in Europe who gathered food, prepared medicines, or worked in a garden, that is, almost every woman and a few religious or scientifically minded men, that this potato was from the same family as nightshade. In South America, that plant family meant potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, and chilies. But in Europe, most people who encountered nightshades might brush up against it as the strange and bitter eggplant, but mostly knew the alkaloid-heavy plants like deadly nightshade and henbane. Extracts of the plants were used as sleeping potions, cosmetic eye drops, anesthetics, particularly in combination with opium, and of course as poison. Henbane was named so because it had been the bane and the death of a fair number of hens. What was a plant family rich in foods to one group of people was a plant family full of dangers to another. As a result, the Incan potato was slowly and sometimes suspiciously adopted around the world in the 16th century. But during the 17th century, the Incan potato came to the notice of people more interested in cash than plant identification. And that is when the Incan potato started to become the Virginia potato in England. It was a starchy, nutritious tuber that could be grown in rather poor ground, which meant it met with great success in Ireland and other regions where the grain harvest could be very chancy due to the weather being on the edge of too cold. The situation in Ireland was, of course, exacerbated by different Irish conquests by different English kings. There, the cereal growing lands had been taken over quite viciously by families benefiting from grants from those kings, and the locals were being pushed away from growing their own food into mostly growing food for other people that was being exported to England. This was a trend both parties would end up expanding. For our story, this meant that the Incan potato that had been brought to Virginia in about the 1640s to feed the Virginia colonies had gone over to England as a hopeful food source for Irish peasants who were losing access to grain. So when the Incan Virginia potato returned once again to North America in about 1719, it was to feed New England, and now it was called the Irish potato or the white potato. In our newfound modern interest in foreign foods, we have now seen the varieties with red, yellow, and purple insides. But in those days, the Incan potato making the rounds was a creamy white. And so in contrast to the orange sweet potato, it was always considered white. And so, as the white potato spread about the colonies, it pushed aside those fussy, skinny carrots, those slightly sulfury turnips, and the somewhat fussy parsnips. And as an imported starch that might stand in for bread, it even made its way onto tables fancy enough to be governed by cookbooks. That's right. After all of that, when we get to the middle and late 18th century in the colonies, the sweet potato is the local food for the poor people, and the Irish potato is the imported food that gets recipes written about it. Quite the turnaround. Oh, and a strange hangover from sweet potatoes and Incan potatoes emerging in the 18th century colonial diet at more or less the same time meant that sweet potato greens were axed from the mainstream American diet before they ever had a chance to take hold. I mean, yeah, the English were never super excited about, oh, yay, another green vegetable, but they did like their kale and cabbage and cress and chard, asparagus and all sorts of pot herbs, and even the occasional tansy for tonics. And they adopted the New World green bean. But in general, they were not out there seeking a wide variety of leafy greens for all seasons. And they largely dismissed sweet potato greens. These same greens were recognized and adopted by many of the West Africans, who were seeking out and cataloging a wide variety of edible leaves to fill in for the absolute salad of vegetation they had had to leave behind. So they adopted those sweet potato greens along with the North American green bean leaves. Those are good greens too. But the European colonists, they overlooked them. Well, the general prejudice against vegetables and local produce was at work here. It seems that the English antipathy for sweet potato greens had a little bit of logic to it. Even as they were able to overcome their ambivalence for the white potato itself, the European colonists were absolutely correct that the green plant that grows above the potato is poisonous. It couldn't even be fed to livestock in large amounts. So as a reflex, they rejected the sweet potato greens out of hand as well. This did not happen in other cultures that picked up the sweet potato. In fact, one of the easiest places to find sweet potato greens in America today are in Asian markets, where it's often labeled water spinach, or in African markets. And they also make a pretty easy, fast-growing backyard crop. So even now, as Americans have re-met the sweet potato in the last few decades, we have not yet taken up the greens. After all that, sweet potato puddings and pies, along with pumpkin puddings and pies, turns out to be one of the first global fusion foods popularized in the colonies. There's the pastry crust of wheat flour and solid fats that were English contributions, as was the use of milk and eggs in the filling itself. Spiced with cloves, cinnamon, ginger, and allspice meant that the flavors of the literal globe, from the Moluccas in the Indian Ocean, India, China, and the Caribbean, were brought together along with sugar that had traveled over 2/3 of the world to be grown in the Caribbean as well. All of this was combined with a tuber or fruit of the Americas. A global fusion food indeed. And as it was served at table alongside maybe beef and potatoes, the colonial table was as global as our modern table. But unlike our modern selves eating Indian food or takeout Chinese, it was invisible to the average diner, and usually to the wealthy worldly one. So the fact that nearly every vegetable item on a colonial table was a foreign invader was rather invisible then, and remained so as the American diet was built. And wow, I am out of space for the fruit side of the fusion food question, which means the tomatoes and melons and chilies and everything else will have to wait for next week. Fusion food, imitations, and misunderstandings will continue as we get deeper into how the American diet really is cobbled together from bits of this and that from all over the globe, but often in ways we don't even see. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Email questions and quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Eventually, promised pictures and links, along with interesting media and books I consumed for the episode, will all find their way to thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is in the show's Twitter, Insta, and Post.News bio, all at THOA Food, and in the show description.